Hello, everyone. This is Colleen Lumsden, and on behalf of Vodafone and 451 Research, I would like to welcome you and say thanks for attending today's webcast titled Preparing Your Business for the Digital Future, Connectivity, Cloud, and Innovation. Today's discussion will be led by Melanie Posey, who is Research Vice President and General Manager of the Voice of the Enterprise at 451 Research. Just a few quick housekeeping items before we get started. To ask a question, simply type it in the question box on your screen, and we will get to as many as we can. The presentation slides are available for download in the resources section on your screen. We will be asking a few polling questions throughout the webinar, so please be sure to submit your answers. And finally, please check back for the on-demand version of the webinar after the conclusion of the live event. And with that, I'll turn it over to Melanie.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. We'll get started with a section looking at some of the digital realities we face as organizations prepare themselves for the digital future. One of the key aspects of the digital future is computing is everywhere, and we're living on the edge in the sense of that edge is being redefined in terms of where computing resources are delivered and the locations from which they're being consumed. And a big part of this redefined edge is networking. Networking matters, and it's indeed the foundation of guaranteeing distributed application delivery and consumption. What I've done on this first slide is taken some data from Cisco's Global Cloud Index and the Visual Networking Index to just provide a little bit of context to our discussion today. And what we're seeing in this digital era is more data center traffic. Increasingly, workloads are being positioned and consumed from cloud data centers. And as a result, we're seeing more cloud data center workloads as well. And we're seeing an increasing, indeed exponential increase in the number of these workloads. We also have more devices, more internet users, more IoT devices and IoT applications, and primarily more big data, because data is the currency and the engine of digital transformation. One thing we're seeing is that the location of data is constantly changing, whereas 10, 15 years ago, applications and compute and storage capacity lived in enterprise data centers. Increasingly, those resources are living in cloud data centers and also in edge data centers, closer to where the end users are and closer to where the data needs to be collected. And Internet of Things and 5G networks are a big part of this edge networking evolution, where you have devices that are connected, automobiles, airplanes, factories, cities, healthcare devices are all out in the field and need to be connected back to a central location for data processing. We're also seeing the paths to data changing. Data is not a one-way street anymore. Data paths are increasingly multi-directional, going from the core to the edge, from the edge to the core, from devices to both the core and the edge, and increasingly from device to device. So what's necessary in this digital world characterized by the edge is a need for federation of all of these diverse ecosystems of users, IT resources, clouds, applications, and data warehouses. And the way this federated interconnectivity happens is through networking. And next we'll take a look at how this works in practice out in the field. And what we're seeing increasingly in the IoT space is multiple different venues. They're at the edge, they're at the near edge, and they're at the core. And the graphic on the left-hand side of the screen kind of shows the hierarchy of the edge in terms of the hyperscale data centers increasingly being at the top, and near edges with smaller data centers and also converged devices. And the edge is where the users are and where the things are, the cities, the businesses, the industries, and also the people that need to connect to some of the resources that are in the core of the network. And what you'll notice here is that latency is a huge factor here. The lower the latency, the better the business model operates, which relies on edge resources and edge computing. And one reason that organizations are landing workloads in various locations, core, near edge, or edge, a lot of it has to do with security and cost, which is pretty much the answer you get from a survey. Anytime you ask anything about IT, the main considerations are always security and cost. But the next thing is networking connections, and that underlies the idea that digital transformation, distributed applications architectures, and distributed IT infrastructure relies considerably on the networking connections that bring everything together and move the data where it needs to be. Next, let's take a look at digital transformation in a little more detail. And from 451 Research's proprietary alliance of IT decision makers in large and medium-sized organizations, what we found is that almost half of organizations that we've surveyed are currently executing on digital transformation. And what we mean by this is that these organizations are digitizing their assets, digitizing their business models, and making data available to feed into the decision-making process for those business operations. And we still have 53% of organizations that are in various stages of evaluation, consideration, or just plain confusion about digital transformation. So one takeaway from this that I often mention to my clients is that if you're a part of the 47% who have already executed on digital transformation, good for you. And if you're part of the 53%, it's time to get going on digital transformation and to start thinking about what are some of the types of partners that can help move you along on that journey. And another thing we did in this survey was to figure out what are some of the key initiatives that are speaking to some of the pain points that organizations are having as they adjust their operations to an increasingly digital world. And one thing we found is that the major thrust of a lot of digital transformation initiatives is improving the customer experience, essentially ensuring that customer loyalty, customer retention is maintained, and increasingly value is delivered through those digital channels. Another big pain point that organizations are having in their business, and they look for digital transformation to solve, is how do we get to be a data-driven business where data informs business decisions related to the customers and also to internal business operations. And then the third major initiative around digital transformation is how do we deliver new digital products and services? Because increasingly a big part of digital transformation is how do you translate or how do you evolve your experience with the customer from a purely physical type of interaction to something that's more interactive and more digital in terms of both customer experience and the value that's ultimately delivered to the customer. And with these pain points in mind, we're interested in hearing how your experience tracks with the experience of the 451 research panel. And so we'll move to our first polling question in this webinar today. And the question is, what do you consider to be the main purpose of embarking on digital transformation? So thinking of your organization's experience with digital transformation, what's the key thing that you're trying to get out of that digital transformation process? And I'll wait a couple of minutes for the responses to tabulate. So please answer the question and choose as many responses as are applicable to your organization. Okay, and with that, I think we'll move on throughout the presentation. And one thing I would ask you to do is, keep in mind some of these reasons for pursuing digital transformation as we move into the next part of the presentation that's more focused on technology. So how does technology enter the picture when organizations are preparing for their digital future? Here's one of the questions that we asked in a recent survey, asking organizations about what are some of the key enablers of business and IT transformation. And we asked about current adoption of some emerging technologies. And what we found was at the top of the list as one of the most game-changing technologies for businesses overall was data analytics tools and platforms, which actually aligns pretty well with some of the initiatives we looked at on the previous slide, in which we asked you about in the first polling question, that customer experience, being able to deliver new products and services, a lot of these depend on data. And then some of the other factors here relate to big data and processing, engines, hardware acceleration products, which make the infrastructure operate in a more efficient manner, cloud native technologies such as containers and serverless computing. And I'd like to draw your attention to software-defined infrastructure, which includes networking in it. And we have about 30% of organizations that already have this technology in use right now. But one thing that we've been seeing increasingly in the members of our panel is that as organizations move to using agile and flexible cloud resources, whether that's with the hyperscale cloud providers or with on-premises private clouds, the infrastructure is now programmable, flexible, and agile, but in some ways the networking still has ways to catch up. So that's one thing to think about as you plan your IT infrastructures for digital transformation, is that it's not enough just to cloudify the compute and the servers and the storage. The networking also has to be brought into play to have that same type of flexibility and agility to respond to changing business requirements. And with that, we will subject you to yet another polling question, which is, here are the responses to the previous polling question, which asked about what are the main purposes of embarking on digital transformation. And to a large extent, the results do track with what our panel told us, that customer experience is the organizing principle of digital transformation. And employee productivity is something that you want to get from digital transformation because it helps with the overall business mission of improving the customer experience. And a fair number of you have also said that having the business intelligence that's needed to make the right decisions for your business is also an organizing principle of digital transformation. So next we will move into how you modernize your IT for the digital era. So we've already talked about what some of the imperatives of digital transformation are. Now let's take a look at how you can organize your IT estates to be ready for that new era of digital consumption and digital delivery. This is a data set which we at 451 revisit a couple of times a year just to get a sense of where organizations are deploying their workloads now and where they look to deploy those a couple years from now. And the way we look at this at 451 Research is something that we call the best execution venue. When you're talking about an application or a workload, there's an entire process in place that allows you to decide where is this workload ideally situated based on a number of different factors having to do with security and also having to do with the characteristics of the application itself. And what we've seen increasingly over the last few years is that workloads are moving to cloud environments. But the key thing to take away here is that they're moving to clouds, not one specific type of cloud environment. And as you can see in the graphic on the right-hand side, the traditional on-premises IT infrastructure in an enterprise data center and through a very CapEx-intensive model is decreasing as organizations start to move to other types of workloads. And the way we asked this question was, where are the majority of your workloads currently deployed and where will they be deployed 2 years from now? And what you can see is a big shift in cloud environments. Public cloud increases from 22% of organizations saying that the majority of their workloads are located in those environments to about 40% by next year. However, at the same time, we're seeing private cloud as a way to organize and to deploy workloads, increasing from 27% to 34%. So the takeaway here is that it's all about clouds and not cloud. And given that there will be multiple types of environments in which enterprise workloads operate, networking will come into play to bring those all together. And at the bottom of the slide, I have here a way of thinking about implementation with regard to modernizing IT for the digital era. And the first step, obviously, is assessing and planning, figuring out which workload is ideally suited for which type of business environment. And then there are the normal stages of design, build, migrate, integrate, operate, and optimize. However, the thing about the digital era is that this is not a one-and-done type of process. There's constant shifting of workloads in response to business demands in the digital world. So the way I would look at this timeline is, kind of lather, rinse, repeat. It's an iterative process that will have to be revisited periodically as the demands of digital transformation dictate. And here are some of the considerations that go into deciding which is the best execution venue and ultimately answering the question, which workloads go where. And on a previous chart, we saw that when it comes to IT, cost and security are always the paramount considerations. But once you get past those benchmark drivers and considerations, you come to some factors that really come into play when you're deciding which type of infrastructure to deploy and which type of partner you might want to have on the journey with you towards that modernization of IT. So application performance, platform reliability are key considerations, as are government regulation and data sovereignty issues, related to GDPR and the recent regulations passed in California, which ultimately will become table stakes for organizations and have to be factored into the equation of what your IT environments look like. And then towards the bottom, you've got latency considerations, again, related to network. But I would argue that taking the latency considerations and looking at it in the context of application performance as well. And so when you add those two together, you've got close to 50% of organizations saying that application performance is the driver of which workloads go where. And, again, back to the point that it's not just about the compute and the storage, it's also about the network in terms of ultimately deciding how well an application performs. And this brings us to the whole issue of hybrid and hybrid IT. And one way we've been looking at this at 451 Research is that hybrid is a thing that just used to happen. You've had organizations who jumped feet first into cloud and started using cloud capabilities, and all of a sudden somebody noticed that, wait a minute, we have multiple IT environments operating our workloads and applications, and we have very little interoperability or visibility over those workloads. So we asked organizations, what is the best description of your organization's overall IT approach and strategy? And over 60% responded that hybrid IT is the way forward, the strategic approach to their IT environments for the digital era. And what this means is that you have integrated systems on premises, in private cloud environments or even non-cloud environments that are linked to the off-premises cloud and hosted resources with hyperscale providers like AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud Platform. And increasingly, we're seeing organizations move to this as an implicit strategy rather than something that just happens. And if you look at the bottom of the slide, you'll see that hybrid IT environments are closely correlated with progress along the digital transformation spectrum. As organizations move closer to executing on their digital strategies, we see increasingly that their overall approach to their IT environments is a hybrid one. And next, we'll take a look at the whole issue of legacy applications. There are very few organizations who have the luxury of simply chucking all of their existing IT estate in favor of a modern IT estate that is flexible and agile enough to meet the demands of digital transformation. So what we asked in this question was, how are organizations approaching the task of modernizing their legacy applications and bringing them along for the digital transformation ride. And what we found was a range of different approaches to this mission-critical legacy application process. And the majority of organizations said that they plan to take a modernization in place approach, which means that they will keep their infrastructure on premises in a traditional data center environment, but update that infrastructure in order to have a more modern application architecture. So again, this is pointing towards the prevalence of hybrid as an overall strategy for IT environments. However, you've got some organizations that plan to take a refactor and shift approach. Everything stays on premises for the time being and gets re-architected into a cloud native framework, and eventually at some point in the future ends up in an off-premises cloud environment. And then there are a couple of other motions here where you move straight to a software as a service approach to application consumption, or where you simply lift and shift and deal with the modernization of the applications later once you get to the cloud. And on the right-hand side of the slide, we've got some of the factors that are driving organizations to take this modernization in place approach. And to a large extent, this is why we have 62% of organizations saying hybrid is their way forward. And the main reason is simply leverage what you already have. The realities of finance and accounting dictate that the resources that are currently in place have to be continually used and depreciated over a certain period of time. And then there's data and system security. Even though we're in the era of, about 50% of organizations are using public cloud environments in some form for their infrastructure, there's still concerns about data and concerns about the security of systems built in hyperscale public clouds overall. So that's one reason for this continuing modernization in place push on the part of organizations. And then there's a question of application dependencies with on-premises IT elements. This is one thing that actually deters a lot of movement to the cloud. And given that organizations are trying to build hybrid IT environments to leverage what they already have and take advantage of some of the new capabilities available in the public cloud environments, this application dependency issue is a huge factor. And it's a factor that brings networking to the table in the sense that minimizing latency between on-premises systems and off-premises systems is a key factor in modernizing IT for the digital era. And here's a view of some of the use cases for hybrid and why organizations are taking this approach. And overall, the answer is flexibility. And one of the key reasons that organizations are using hybrid environments is to be able to migrate workloads as needed between on-premises and public cloud environments. And as I mentioned previously, there are a lot of different reasons for putting a workload in one environment or another. And as conditions change, those changing conditions might dictate moving it to yet another IT environment. And a lot of these requirements have to do with, as I mentioned previously, regulations, cost, speed, and agility, and also some of the characteristics of the applications themselves. And I think one thing to consider as part of your digital transformation journey and how you modernize your IT to make that happen is to have a variety of different workloads where different applications or different environments where applications can be placed. This best execution venue idea is very useful in terms of being agile and flexible and responding to new market conditions, such as a new market opens up or a new supplier comes into the supply chain. You need to get them connected and get them access to resources as quickly as possible, and a hybrid environment is one way to do that. Next, we will move on to another polling question. And this question has to do with networking requirements and the extent to which you typically consider them as integral to your overall cloud strategy. So I'll give you a few minutes to answer that question before we move on to the next section. Right. Okay. Now let's take a look at the responses. And amazingly, 100% of you have mentioned that networking requirements are considered integral to your cloud strategy. And I think this reflects a change that we've seen in the market with regard to in previous years, networking was maybe an afterthought that came into play after the compute and the storage and the data issues have been dealt with. But as I mentioned in the first slide at the top of this presentation, we are increasingly living in an edge environment where there are multiple edges in any organization's IT estate, and these have to be connected together, and they also have to be flexible enough to respond to changes and also flexible enough to provide the bandwidth needed when data transfer or data processing requires higher levels of bandwidth. So it's beyond mere interconnection and interconnectivity. It's all about movement of data and workloads as well. So next we'll take a look specifically at networking in terms of hybrid and multi-cloud IT environments, and looking at this from the perspective of what are some of the primary networking related goals for 2020. And again, we see the role that networking plays in application and workload performance. And also, another big goal is supporting the volume of applications and workloads as it relates to digital transformation, which is increasingly founded upon the availability and the ability to process vast amounts of data. And also, one goal for networking is being able to measure the performance of applications, latency, throughput, the standbys of networking definitely have a role to play in terms of the metrics used to determine digital business operations and the extent to which the value is being delivered to the customer with adequate performance. And here's a view also on why networking is so important. We talked about hybrid before. That's kind of on-premises and off-premises. But organizations are also using multiple off-premises cloud environments for their workloads and applications as well. According to 451's research, about 70% of organizations are using more than one public cloud vendor for infrastructure as a service. And the other thing we found was that about 45% of those people using more than one public cloud say that 80% or more of their usage is with a primary vendor. So what this means is that you do have a primary cloud vendor, but there are other vendors in the mix as well. And part of best execution venue thinking dictates that one cloud vendor may be great for a particular workload or application, but maybe another workload is better suited or better tailored to the capabilities of a different cloud provider. So this whole issue of multiple execution venues is not just related to whether it's on premises or off premises, but there's variation off premises as well, as we have multiple edges in enterprise IT environments. And now we've got our last polling question for the webinar, and we would like to know how many cloud providers does your company currently work with? And we'll give a few minutes to tabulate those responses. Great. And now we will reveal the responses to that question. And it actually tracks pretty well with what we found in our research as well, that there are only about 20% of you who only use one provider. And so that underpins the notion that multiple providers are in play in enterprise IT estates. Therefore, those multiple edges need to be connected. And how do you get set for the IT, the digital era? And IT transformation for the digital era, one way to think about it is day zero and day one, which is all about the assessment and the planning and figuring out how the integration and the migration is going to go, and then getting set for the next phase of things. This day zero, day one piece is extremely important because it in some ways determines the success of subsequent strategies. So if cloud readiness is all about ready, set, then management and optimization is the go phase of things. And this day two process of the infrastructure is in place. How does it operate? How is it managed? What's the governance structure like? What's the usage structure like in terms of the degree of self-service that's available to end users that need the infrastructure for their digital transformation plans? How do you manage costs and optimize resources? And then how does continuous improvement happen? Because again, this is not a one and done process. It's lather, rinse, repeat. Continuous improvement is part of IT transformation for the digital era. And it's a good idea to think about what type of partner you might want to look for to manage the complexity that's involved in this continuous iterative process of infrastructure optimization. And here's the upshot of things, is that IT transformation is complex, but it's not necessarily the case that you want to resolve the complexity. So you have this idea of willful complexity that comes about because there are all of these new capabilities available with cloud-based IT environments. But then the unintentional complexity comes in with how do you control all of that? If resources are available on demand, how do you control the governance and the security of your IT environment? And the answer is that you optimize this balance between capability and control. And the way you do that is with managed and professional services, that you have the flexible agile infrastructure in place as the engine for digital transformation, but then you have managed and professional services in place to provide that level of control, visibility, and governance that's needed to move forward with digital transformation and also have security, control, and governance in place. And we're seeing increasingly that organizations are moving towards managed services as a way to optimize the balance between capability and control, and also to help avoid some of the traffic jams that can happen with continuous, fast-moving transformation. And we asked organizations about what managed services related to cloud are they using now and what do they plan to use in the next couple of years. And we see a movement from the old standby of backup and recovery to some more in-depth services related to how do we ensure the proper functioning of our operations on a day-to-day basis? How do we manage our applications? How do we deal with the security environment for cloud workloads and data? How do we deal with integration and migration with on-premises systems? These are some of the challenges that will come into play as organizations build hybrid and multi-cloud IT environments. And these are some of the responses in terms of bringing in managed and professional services as a way to optimize the balance and live with the complexity. Everyone is at a different point in the digital transformation and IT transformation journey. So one way to look at this is the initial phase is cloud infrastructure management, where it's all about optimizing the IT environment, getting visibility into some of the brownfield IT things, which might live partly on premises and partly in the cloud, and being able to optimize that cloud environment you have in terms of making sure that the resource allocation is appropriate to the workload demands, and also bringing into place some policies to help address some of the control issues related to shadow IT. And then the next phase, where the infrastructure is getting more agile, it's all about, okay, what do we do with this new infrastructure that we have in place that gives us a lot more options? Refactor, modernize, and replatform. This is where automation comes into play. This is where systems get instrumented in a way that visibility and control is preserved across the entire estate. And you have something that looks more like an IT as a service structure. And then finally, as we move from operation-centric to development and application-centric environments, we're seeing this whole idea of having a consistent platform for applications that can run anywhere on these multiple edge environments we talked about previously. And one way to ensure the consistency of that environment so that workloads can indeed run anywhere is to have the networking in place that connects everything into a federated, although distributed whole. And as we move along this transformation journey, what we see is an increasing focus on cloud application management. How do we manage the applications and the workloads that drive digital transformation rather than a concern solely with the infrastructure? And as we move along this spectrum, value and agility increase as infrastructure becomes more standardized, more automated, and more network aware. So to wrap up, I just wanted to offer a few thoughts about what to look for in a digital era cloud partner. And we talked a little bit about infrastructure here, but ultimately the path to digital transformation is indeed beyond infrastructure, in the sense that the partners are able to help organizations deploy and manage this infrastructure, which is essentially the operational hub for digital IT. So taking into account the compute, the storage, the applications, and the security, and having all of that interconnected from the core to the edge. And then there's the issue of operational efficiency across these multiple IT environments. And there are a lot of different variations here: on-prem, off-prem, cloud, legacy, public-private, fully managed, co-managed. And that is the state of IT these days. It's neither this nor that. It's a multiple hybrid, multi-cloud type of environment. And then there's the whole issue of security and flexibility for the connectivity. We're living in a multi-access world where organizations need to connect to different third-party cloud resources and distributed business locations and users. And overall, what we think is the thing to look for in a digital era partner is someone you can have a consultative dialogue with. It's all about engagement and iteration on some of the key issues that keep an organization flexible and agile to meet the demands of digital transformation. And just a few takeaways before we move to the Q&A portion. Digital transformation, it eventually simplifies IT, but there are complications that abound in the short term, and there are continuous management and orchestration challenges related to hybrid and multi-cloud IT environments. And these diverse IT estates and application runtime environments will see, as a feature of digital transformation, need unified management and IT normalization. And one aspect of that normalization is having consistent, standardized networking connecting all of the different parts of the edge. And we talk a lot about cloud native and app development in relation to digital transformation these days. And, to some extent, you have this low code, no code environment, and that's all great. But somebody or something needs to manage how those functions execute on the infrastructure and optimize the performance of that. And then there's one thing about digital transformation is culture. And you need to find the balance between what used to be a top-down command and control type of IT environment to something that empowers the developers and empowers line of business people to get the resources they need to act and execute on digital transformation. And with that, I'll just put a slide up here from the sponsors of the webinar, Vodafone Business and IBM, and I'll keep this up during the Q&A portion, which if we could begin that now.
Thanks so much, Melanie. It's now time for our Q&A session. As a reminder, simply type in your question in the box on your screen, and we will get to as many as we can. The first question today, I think you're saying that having multiple cloud vendors is okay. What are the key pitfalls to avoid?
I think one of the key things to avoid is to not have some idea of specialization with the multiple cloud providers. I mean, I think that certain workloads should be with certain cloud providers, and the choice being made that, say you have a big data workload, which cloud provider has the best capabilities for those types of workloads. And you might have a different answer on who's the best cloud provider for, say an SAP workload that you want to move to a cloud environment. So I think the pitfall is kind of moving workloads willy-nilly to different cloud providers based on some criterion other than what is the optimal execution environment. And the one pitfall we've seen is organizations that sort of chase after, the lowest cost provider and, move workloads around based solely on cost and not related to other factors such as is the cloud provider in the geos you need it to be in, do they have a proven track record on, say, AI and ML? So, I think keeping those criteria in mind related to the characteristics and requirements of the workload is, one way to keep a handle on using multiple cloud providers in a single IT environment.
Next question. Are some workloads objectively better suited for public cloud environments versus private on-prem or colo environments?
That's always an interesting question. And in a broad sense, I would say no. There's not any workload that is constitutionally unsuitable for a public cloud or a private cloud environment. What it all comes down to is where, what the organization hopes to achieve by moving something from an on-prem to an off-prem environment. Because they're AWS and Azure and GCP, they can all run heavy-duty business workloads like SAP HANA in cloud environments now. That it's just a matter of technology, whether an application can work in this environment or that environment. I think the thing that organizations need to think about is if you're moving something to a public cloud environment, what is your objective in doing that? Is it to be able to scale on demand? Is the requirement geographic expansion? Is the requirements maybe something that's financial or operational, that you're closing your enterprise data center and the workloads need to go somewhere? And I think that, that whole process I mentioned earlier in the presentation of, assess and plan and design and, integrate, apply that process to every workload. You're thinking about moving to a cloud environment or moving back from a cloud environment, and let that be your guide on the suitability of that workload for a public or a private cloud environment.
All right, another question just came in. Does the environment comply with data security standards? For example, ISO 27001?
Could you repeat the question, please?
It says, does the environment comply with data security standards?
Oh, okay. The one thing to think about when you look at public cloud environments is that the overall infrastructure, it's compliant in the sense that the processes in AWS, Azure, GCP data centers all comply with the major regulations. The issue when moving workloads to the public cloud is that the way you utilize those resources and the way you put the resources together to support a workload, that's where the security and compliance pitfalls can happen. Because it's important to remember that a hyperscale platform is, in essence, like a box of Legos. You have all of these different pieces and capabilities you can use to put together operational environments for your applications and your workloads. But whether those environments are secure or compliant has less to do with the foundational platform itself and more to do with how you put that environment together. So that's maybe one argument in favor of working with a managed service provider in order to ensure that the environments that get built in public cloud, on public cloud platforms are secure and compliant, to the standards that are typical of an enterprise data center. Cloud is different, but in some ways, those environments that get put together have to be secure and compliant, just like any other IT environment.
Another question. Do the customers get support on cloud implementation only or on regular maintenance like server backup, slicing, and patching?
Yeah, that's one thing I mentioned in those two slides that had the circles on them related to cloud readiness and also to management, orchestration, and optimization. That, once you get the cloud environment implemented, now the game is just starting with regard to how that environment gets maintained, how it gets updated, how it gets optimized in the course of its operation. So, one way to look at managed services for cloud is the environment gets built, then it gets maintained and optimized over time as business conditions change. And one thing we found in our research is that there is a huge lack of skills within organizations related to cloud platform expertise. Every IT environment, has folks who know all about security, who know all about storage, who know all about compute, but those skills that were put into practice in the data center, you do those things differently in a public cloud environment, which is another argument in favor of looking at a managed services provider to, help translate some of those data center skills into cloud environment skills.
What are some of the factors driving organizations towards hybrid or multi-cloud deployments? One of the big factors around hybrid and multi-cloud is, simply that, most companies didn't start up yesterday. So there is a lot of investment in data centers and equipment, and, there is an awful lot of data that, the basic systems of record that help organizations run the business that maybe can't be moved for regulatory reasons, or, it could be moved, but, it's an awful lot of trouble. It's an awful lot of expense involved. So we're seeing the hybrid multi-cloud approach as a way for organizations to leverage what they have in place already, to leverage the data and processes associated with their current business operations, and then build on those in a cloud environment by creating maybe front-end customer interaction systems or developing new ways of managing the supply chain. So I think that hybrid multi-cloud is the perfect way to kind of take what you've already built with your business and increasingly digitize your business through new capabilities that are built in a cloud environment, which also allow you to get further out to the edge with new things like IoT, and also
out to the edge in terms of being able to interact with customers in different geographies without having to build a data center in order to enable that.
Great. We have time for one final question. Is there a future for private cloud? Won't the future be all public cloud?
Absolutely not. The future is heterogeneous, and the future is hybrid and multi-cloud. As I mentioned previously, most organizations do have a lot of business processes that could move to the cloud, but there's no compelling reason necessarily to do so. So when you think about organizations having hybrid IT and multi-cloud environments, you actually need a partner that has experience in both worlds, in the data center world and also in the cloud world, related to not just the cloud platform, but some of the cloud applications like IoT and various edge applications. So public and private will coexist for quite a while in this environment, and the key is to find an organization, a partner that can help you navigate both of those worlds. And I would encourage all of the listeners and participants on this webinar today to reach out to Vodafone Business and IBM in the Vodafone IBM partnership around cloud, which they're an example of the type of provider that has a foot in both worlds and can help organizations with the cloud readiness piece and also the management, optimization, and orchestration of hybrid multi-cloud environments. And with that, thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks so much, Melanie. That concludes our webinar today. As a reminder, the on-demand replay of this webcast will be available shortly. On behalf of IBM and Vodafone Business and 451 Research, thank you so much for attending and have a great day.